Hello and welcome back to the Double Loop Podcast, your source for everything about fingerprints. We're coming up on episode 15 here, and special welcome to the finicky faculty finding forensic friends. I'm Eric Ray.
And I'm Glenn Langenberg.
And welcome back. We're up to episode 15. This is, almost 4 months we've been going on this. This is great.
Yeah, it's been a good run so far. And again, we're still picking up plenty of listeners. And like you said, hopefully grabbed a few new people from the workshop that you did, the RTI workshop.
Yeah, I actually saw a nice little spike in listeners after that. So hopefully everyone that heard about it for the first time through that workshop, thanks for listening, and hopefully you'll stick around. So, Glenn, I heard you had something new happen this past week. What have you been up to the week of Thanksgiving last week?
Well, the day after Thanksgiving, I went for LASIK surgery. I finally decided that it was time, and I've been saving up all year with a pre-tax fund. So I decided that I was going to do this procedure, and I really wanted to do a little bit of research. I remember 10 some years ago when this was available. I didn't want to do it then. I wanted to wait for the technology to catch up, talk to other people that had done it, see what happens 5-10 years down the line. And everyone that I've spoken with have said the same thing. Best choice they've ever made. They were so happy to have done it, and no problems. I don't know if you've ever heard contrary, but no one said anything different to me.
No, that's all I've heard as well. I have heard some people leaning a little bit more towards the implantable contact lenses, just because those can be more easily adjusted or reversed or something like that. But I've never really heard of any specific problems with either one. Are you so far doing okay?
Yeah, this is my second or third day of recovery, and everything went basically as they said it would. So the procedure itself was kind of weird. I was worried that my eye would be moving as they're starting to slice into the cornea. I didn't know how they're going to keep it steady, but they put this ring on your eye that almost creates like a suction and kind of sucks your eye a little bit. It didn't really hurt. It was just strange to have your eyeball sucked out a little bit of the socket and held in place. But again, it didn't hurt. It just felt strange. And, there's this moment, and it's a very strange procedure. It feels very much like the movie Brazil, and very, dystopian society where there's shining lights in your eyes and laser beams are coming down. And there is a moment where you can actually feel practically a cut in your eye. I mean, it felt like a little pinch. I don't know if you've ever, I wear contacts, and so occasionally I've had to, I've grabbed what I thought was a contact, but I missed my contact and pinched my cornea, and it stings for a second, but it's not not a huge deal. And that's what it felt like. It felt like a little bit of pinch to the cornea, and then they had removed a little flap of the cornea. And then you go over to another laser, and they shine lasers into that, and then essentially burn off some of your cornea. You can smell a little burning material. So again, there's a little bit of a gross factor, but it didn't hurt. It's just weird and awkward, and lights being shined into your eye, and you can't look away. Which is one thing, when you're in pain, the first reaction is to close your eyes or look away. No, you can't do that. And it only lasts for about less than 5 minutes. I had to be in that room, probably less than 5 minutes, and then they let you open your eyes right away. After they burn off the cornea a little bit, they put the flap back on, and they described it. Actually, they described it as essentially removing a manhole cover and putting a manhole cover back. So it's not like it's moving around in your eye. If you can't get your fingers into the groove to pull out a manhole cover, it's not going anywhere. And I thought that was actually a pretty good analogy. And then they walked me back into a room and checked my eye, and basically 5 minutes I sit there, they put a few drops in my eye, and then they send me home. And it was in and out. Now, the ride home was excruciating. It was excruciatingly painful. I can't drive, so I had to get a ride. And just the entire way. The sun, I would recommend if someone's going to do this, they do it at night or after the sun has gone down. It was just excruciatingly painful, blindingly sharp, the light. And when I got home, they recommend that you just take a nap for a few hours. And I thought, yeah, no problem, because I can fall asleep anywhere. It was actually very difficult to fall asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, it was like I had sand in my eyes or molten lava. I mean, it was pretty painful those first couple of hours. And in fact, my eyes actually felt better if I kept them open. Because every time I closed, it just felt like I had something in my eye that I wanted to get out of my eye. But eventually I fell asleep. When I woke up, the pain was gone. It still was a little weird, and then vision came into focus. And essentially 4 hours later, I was seeing 20/20. And then another 4 hours later, I was seeing better than 20/20. And then the next day, I could actually drive to my appointment. They did an eye check, and everything's fine. Other than a little bit of pain in the eye and some headaches just from over sensitivity to light, 3 days later, everything's fine, and I'm seeing 20/20 now. So it was cool. And from the perspective of fingerprints, though, if any fingerprint examiners are thinking about getting this done, they're probably worried about, of course, their livelihood. And I've known a couple of fingerprint examiners who have done this procedure, and I haven't noticed any change in their casework. I don't know if do you know any that have done this procedure? Fingerprint examiners?
I don't. I've seen people talk about it like on the CLPEX web boards, but I don't know anyone personally who's gone through it. Not that I know of, anyway.
Yeah, and I know about 3 or 4, and I know some that have done the old procedure where they used to use a knife to cut off that layer of the cornea, a razor-sharp, thin knife, and nowadays they just use a laser. And I've known people have done both, and some that did it 10 years ago, and they said, yeah, they haven't really noticed any change whatsoever. And before this, again, for the listeners, before I was going to do this procedure, Eric and I, we had talked about doing a quick little grayscale test, because that was the one thing that you and I had discussed, was whether or not it would change my grayscale ability. So for the listeners, there's something out there, and you can, do an internet search, but it's called the Pelli-Robson chart. Pelli. That's the first guy's name, and the second guy's name is Robson, R-O-B-S-O-N, Pelli-Robson. And just like an eye chart for 20/20 vision, it's a grayscale chart that goes essentially from pure black to almost pure white, and you have shades of gray. It's basically like an eye chart, but for grayscale. And before the procedure, Eric and I had looked at the chart, and now for the listeners, if you go and download this or you want to email me, I'm happy to send you a picture of this. Just realize that you'll be limited by your computer screen. If your computer screen only shows 16 shades of gray, you're not going to be able to see, what the 64 or 100 different shades of gray on the chart.
And every computer screen is going to be calibrated a little bit differently, so depending on which screen you use, that may lead you to be able to see more shades of gray or less, depending on how it's all calibrated.
Right. And so I looked at it on a high quality, essentially what you're talking about, a 1028, DPI screen. And before the procedure, I was able to see almost all the letters. In the very last line, they start to get very, very faint. And there was one I wasn't sure about. So out of all the letters, there's essentially one I couldn't read. And the last 2 letters on there are almost white, but I was still able to make out their shapes. Okay, so now after the procedure, now this is just 3 days after, and maybe things will be a little bit different, but there's definitely a difference. On that last line where I could read 5 out of 6 letters, I can only read about 3 of them now. And essentially the last 3 I can't make out. But I can't also look at things that are very bright for too long, and the whiteness of the chart is blinding to me. So I just have a little bit of trouble looking at the lightness of the chart, or any screen or anything that's kicking out a lot of light. So maybe in another, maybe next week I'll take a look at it again and see, but there was definitely a little loss there, but it's pretty minimal.
Yeah. No, that's where I was at, whereas I couldn't really see the last 3 just with the screen I was looking at. Another thing that I was thinking about just now is how that chart really only looks at half of the grayscale equation. If we were to invert it to make the background black, and then the letters increasingly more black, that'd be another kind of interesting measure of how well you can see grayscale. I guess too bad I didn't think of this before you had your surgery, so we can get a baseline reading for that.
Yeah, I had never even thought about that either. I suppose you could just take the chart in Photoshop and just flip it. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Well, we'll see. Maybe just comparing, since we're pretty close to the same spot. What I can see now versus what you'd be able to see with that reversed color. So
yeah, and I'll mention one other thing. I know that there are some people out there who are interested in maybe considering perhaps even this chart for a screening test for latent print or fingerprint examiner applicants. And I'm just going to, again, iterate what we said earlier. I think it's important, if you're going to do something like that, you should actually buy the actual printed chart. It's a couple $100 at least. You can find them online and you can order them. But you should really get a printed chart, because as Eric and I were as we were discussing, you are going to be limited by the screen or the computer, as opposed to having an actual chart that shows the printed colors of scale, so that that's never a limiting factor. Anyway, just mentioning that in case someone out there is listening, thinking, "Ooh, that's a good idea for a test to include for screens."
Yeah, I kind of showed it around the office and had different people come in and take a look at it, and essentially everyone could kind of get to the same spot on the chart, but the only real difference we saw was that the younger examiners, our trainees, they could see it quicker. So as you got older, you could see it, but you had to stare at the screen a little bit before it would kind of come into view. So that was the only real interesting difference that we saw between different people.
Yeah, and even the letters that I can see on the chart now, they're not as they don't stand out as much. It's like everything sort of shifted a little bit. The last few letters I could barely make out are now the letters I could make out easier before. Now I can barely make them out. So I mean there's almost like I'd say about a 10% shift in my grayscale ability. But to repeat what I said, this is only a couple of days after the procedure,
right.
And my eyes are supposed to be acclimating over the next week or two, and even month, they said.
Well, next little quick topic before we hit our main focus for today. I saw another newspaper article coming out of Canada, who seems to be just publishing interesting fingerprint decisions. Came from Kamloops, British Columbia. Which is further north towards the middle of British Columbia, not necessarily down next to Vancouver. But the decision was that the judge, the RCMP arrested a guy who had firearms in his house who wasn't supposed to. Found a fingerprint of the ID to this guy on duct tape that was on the stock of a sawed-off shotgun. He went in to testify to that. And the judge decided that this was strong circumstantial evidence, but there was this possibility that he could have used the tape on something else, and then it somehow, from somebody else taking off that tape, reused it onto the shotgun. So it wasn't proof enough that he was in possession of this shotgun. So he was convicted on a different charge and released after time served. So not quite the same kind of thing as the last decision where the judge basically didn't believe the ID. This one, the judge kind of came up with some complicated scenario as to why the finger ID wasn't anything more than circumstantial evidence in this case.
Yeah, we had a kidnapping case in Minnesota that was along those same lines, where the argument was Well, if it was at the end of the roll versus in the middle of the roll. And so one of the things the analyst had to do was report where the fingerprint was and show an image as well. This was not on the end of the roll, but rather more in the middle of the roll. So you would have had to unravel, several feet of tape before you would have encountered, this print. And so that actually went a long way in our case, but that issue came up whether or not it was at the end of the roll or in the middle. And I don't think the Canadian case really said if it was at the end of the piece of tape versus in the middle somewhere.
Right. No, they didn't really specify that. It was just the judge said that the defendant could have previously used a portion of the tape, and then that portion was rolled back up into the roll. But I guess it just kind of goes back to the same thing we talked about before. If there's only so much you can do, and if the judge or jury or whoever's trying the case just chooses to not believe you no matter what you say, then there's not really anywhere else to go from there.
Right, and that's the judge's decision. If he didn't feel that this multi-time felon who has a history of drugs and dealing drugs, and if he didn't feel that was sufficient evidence to show also that he had guns in his room that he went in and out of, according to the article,
and high on meth and heroin at the time.
At the time, right? Then he's just a victim of circumstance. That's on that judge.
Yep. Hopefully he, it looks like the article pointed out he graduated high school and has experience in framing houses, and so.
Working on oil rigs too, I think it said. So we'll probably encounter him at some point in North Dakota or South Dakota.
He'll get a job down there. Maybe he can just take this opportunity and move on to a productive role in society.
Maybe. Because that's what usually happens.
Well, yeah. Let's, Glenn, jump right into the main topic of the day. We'd promised listeners last week that we would expand a little bit on discussions that we've had with Nicole Egley, with Alice Maceo a little bit, and talk about different options for conclusions.
Right. So I'm sure listeners have been waiting with bated breath over the last week to hear about the verbal scale. And so what I did was I just went back to some of the original literature. And I mean, there was a number of people that contributed to this. So I don't want to say that, that it's all one person, but I mean, there's certainly a group of people, and it's probably most identified with Ian Evatt out of the UK. But I'm looking at an article, and Graham Jackson and another man by the name of Lambert, I don't know him, and McCroson are authors on an article. But I know Graham and Ian have been big proponents of this for quite a long time. And it was an article in Science and Justice, and it's called The Impact of the Principles of Evidence Interpretation on the Structure and Content of Statements. And it was written back in 2000. And there's a couple of other articles related to this, but this is one that really stands out. And they essentially, they talk about, of course, the first thing is the hierarchy of propositions. Essentially, you are looking at three levels of propositions when it comes to forensic work. The first being the source, that the person is the source of a fingerprint or not, or the source of a crime scene bloodstain or not. Right. So that's the first one, is source. The second one is activity. How did that get there? What were the actions that contributed to that being deposited on the surface? So in fingerprints, the person handled the gun and placed his finger on the trigger, and he left, the fingerprint, or his finger was on the trigger, when it was pulled, or something like that. That gets into an area we've talked about in other shows where we have to be a little bit careful about, what our testimony is and what, how far we can take that.
Right. In some circumstances, by the positioning of the finger, maybe it could imply how they were holding the bottle, whether in more of a drinking fashion or a striking fashion, and then would also include the possibility of like a forgery or fabrication, where the source is correct of that fingerprint, but just the activity that left that print there may be in question.
Yeah, exactly. And so then the highest level of proposition is the offense. The person left that person left their fingerprint on the trigger when they pulled it and shot and murdered that person. Now that usually goes well beyond the bounds of any fingerprint examiner's testimony, unless in the few rare instances the fingerprint examiner is the detective, in the case where he's also the investigator. In the United States that can happen. That's fairly rare, but it can happen. But I would expect that to be a fairly limited set of circumstances.
Yes, yeah, I would think so.
Okay, so that's the first thing about the articles. They talk about these levels of propositions. So then, if we're talking about source propositions, they then go on to discuss a verbal scale. And the idea with the verbal scale is that it starts off with what's essentially a true inconclusive, that the evidence neither favors he's the source or he's not the source. So he could equally be likely. It could be him or anyone else. The chances are equal. Essentially, that's a true inconclusive. And that's what happens when your likelihood ratio is basically 1. When your likelihood ratio is equal to 1, then you can't say anything about the evidence. It's a couple of ridges, maybe, or a very, very faint impression where you can't see a delta. All you can do is just tell that you've got friction ridges there, nothing discriminating.
Right. Essentially, the true inconclusive of how we kind of define that now. You can't say one way or the other anything about the source of the fingerprint.
Right. And then as the evidence begins to, mount one direction or the other, let's go towards the identification, well, then you get a similar pattern type. And if we just stop at similar pattern type, we know that lots and lots of people can share, millions of people can share the same pattern type. So it's not overwhelming evidence, but of course the person can't be excluded. So on this scale, that would be something like limited evidence or weak evidence to support that they're from the same source. It's not saying it's not the person, it's just they share a class characteristic. And if you go, to paint or glass or some of the other trace exams, you start getting the same kind of thing. You've got some very generic class characteristics that are not uncommon and shared by millions of other objects of similar composition.
Right, like even a footwear comparison would do something like that, right?
Oh, yeah, sure, exactly. You can tell it's a Nike Air Jordan size 8 or 9 or 10, something like that. Something so broad that could just be shared by millions and millions of other things.
Right, very, very common kind of things. But at least in the group, it's not excluded from the group at this point.
Right, and you're not saying anything other than that it's limited evidence that supports that they could have come from the same source. That's all you're saying. All right, so then the next thing is now you begin to add a little bit more detail in agreement. So let's say we've got our pattern type and 4 minutia. So now you could begin to exclude some individuals, but the individual in question we're not able to, and we're starting to mount some evidence towards the fact it could be his print, that he may be the source. So now the scale goes from limited evidence or weak evidence to support to moderate evidence to support. And so maybe in a footwear impression, that's having the right size, the right make, Nike Air Jordan, size 8, and maybe even some wear, a little bit of wear on there, or a couple of other class characteristics that are now showing up. So again, it's starting to go in that direction of an identification, but still falling well short of it.
Right, and then as more evidence would be seen, more characteristics, more specific characteristics, then the level of support would continue to rise, and then the question comes up is, as you then increase the amount of evidence that supports this conclusion that they're from the same source, then you have this choice to make of whether or not to just stick with the scale like we've discussed before, to going all the way up to extremely strong support, or at some point decide that there is just such overwhelming support for this conclusion that they're from the same source that you switch over to just this more definitive statements of saying identification.
Right. But in purity of the scale, identification isn't on there. So, you go from moderate to the next one, as you said, it would maybe be strong support and then very strong support. And potentially there could be even a category with, the article talks about likelihood ratios that are 1 million or higher that would be extremely strong support. And that's where we start getting into what we might think of an identification, the zone of identification. And, you end up with the scale of weak, moderate, strong, very strong, extremely strong, and so forth. So, in reading the articles, their purest position is to do away with identification and just report the degree of tilt of the scale. Is the scale tilting one way or the other? And it does go the other way. You can have limited evidence to support they're not from the same source, moderate evidence to support they're not, extremely strong evidence they're not from the same source, and so forth. But in keeping with the spirit of the paper, they do away with exclusions and identifications, or eliminations and identifications if you're in footwear, whatever field you're in.
Right. I would guess one of the benefits I would see of this kind of scale is you basically eliminate the error. Because at no point can you really... I guess you could assign the wrong level of support to a conclusion.
Yeah, and in fact, there is something called... You do away... You're right, you do away from error rates in false positives and false negatives, but then you enter something else called the rate of misleading evidence. So if you were basically saying that it's in favor of something, on one side of the scale, but it was really coming from a different source, well, then that's the rate of misleading evidence. So you're still in that realm that can happen. It's just the idea is, and you haven't gone so far as to say definitively they are or aren't from the same source. So it can technically happen. The benefit here is, of course, it does open up the inconclusive box. Now, what I've heard from many people who don't agree with this approach is, well, how do we assign these things? Aren't we just sort of guessing that it's one or the other? And my argument has been, well, how do we assign an identification? Why is that category so different than any of these other categories? What gives us special powers to say that this is an identification versus why it's the same set of skills that would lead me to say this is strong support, that they're coming from the same source. You're essentially looking at the evidence and attempting to categorize it into a box, into to some kind of category, which is what we already do with identification, exclusion, or one giant inconclusive.
And now there are agencies that have maybe not completely gone to this level of breakdown of the inconclusive, but have begun to open it up a little bit. Obviously, we're talking with Alice a couple weeks ago. That's one agency that's doing that, and she's written a paper kind of explaining how that works for their agency. Have you guys done that up in Minnesota?
No, we have not. This was discussed some years ago, but our agency has more of an approach that everyone needs to be on board. So we all need to be doing the same thing. And not everyone was on board with that. And this is a fairly contentious issue. I know of a handful of other agencies that are, doing qualified inconclusives. They're breaking that box open. I don't know of anyone in the States that's using this type of verbal scale. Now, let me clarify, in the States. Right. Over in Europe, there are a number of agencies. I shouldn't say a number, but there is a growing faction that are starting to move towards these. And certainly the FSS, when they existed, they don't exist anymore, they were reporting this. And FSS is this, semi-private government agency in the UK, the Forensic Science Service, where Ian Evatt worked and several of these other people worked that were proponents of this. And so they were using a verbal scale. Over in Europe right now, there are a couple of agencies that are using this, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say who, but I'll just simply say that there are a few government agencies in Europe that are using verbal scales for fingerprints, and they're definitely using verbal scales in other areas such as footwear and handwriting and so forth. Right,
which is very common, and it's. That's what's going on here in the States as well. with a verbal scale in some of those disciplines.
Yeah, but they're using this type of verbal scale. That
Okay.
I mean, we at my agency we do have a qualified conclusions for footwear, but it doesn't look like this. It doesn't look like limited or weak evidence or moderate evidence or strong evidence to support. It's things like consistent with, or
Right.
cannot exclude, or show some class characteristics but insufficient individual characteristics. They're more descriptions about their observations as opposed to a verbal scale that's supposed to represent the strength of the evidence, and correlate to likelihood ratios.
Right, more of a generic verbal scale.
Yeah,
they're more of a specific to the discipline that they're dealing with verbal scale.
Right.
Now, just talking with some of the old timers at our lab before they all retired or moved on to other things, it seems like we had for a while a conclusion that was basically cannot identify or exclude, and it wasn't inconclusive, but it was just kind of our own private code word for those prints where everything you saw was in common, but just not enough to identify.
So you're saying essentially very strong evidence to support that they're from the same source.
Exactly, but we didn't. That wasn't phrased like that. It was
Right.
It was phrased as could neither identify nor exclude.
But see, that's what I like about a verbal scale is you have a universal scale that you can communicate to someone else. Here's what I'm saying. You don't need verbal code. You don't
Right.
need an agency's code word for something that's too easily confused. Everyone can go to the same generic scale and say, here's what I'm saying.
And I'm sure, have you heard of I mean, has your agency ever done something like that, where you had this kind of word game that meant something internally to you?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think the one thing that we had done before was to simply say that suspect X, Y can be excluded, Z cannot be excluded. In fact, additional exemplars are needed specifically for the number 7 finger. Something like that, where you're basically saying, I need highest quality exemplars possible for the number 7 finger, in the hopes that maybe if you got those highest quality exemplars, you might be able to pull out a little bit of level 3 detail. But again, I don't think that we had any other way of communicating almost an identification.
A couple of years ago, it was right after the article came out that Alice wrote. We sat down, and it'd been a while since we'd used that phrase. It was kind of an old time phrase of could neither identify nor exclude, and we just kind of asked, well, what is, if we got asked on the stand, what did that mean? What would we say? And just kind of all talked it through and said, we would say that we see this amount in agreement. It's not enough to make the identification. We don't see anything in disagreement that could lead us to exclude. So that's why we're kind of in between on this, and but recognize that there is this more information here than just saying inconclusive. So we kind of came forward with our own way. It wasn't quite the way that Vegas Metro had gone with describing it. So when we have these comparisons that reach this kind of very strong support, the way we phrase that is by stating that the result of the comparison was inconclusive. However, everything here in the comparison is in agreement. There's nothing in disagreement, and it's insufficient to come to that identification conclusion. So our report will be a little more descriptive, maybe like we would be on the stand, describing that conclusion a little bit better than just saying could neither identify nor exclude.
Yeah, and currently our agency is taking the position that they're essentially not saying anything beyond inconclusive, and then giving the reason why. It's either the knowns or limited information in the latent print. I have a personal viewpoint, but the agency as a group has decided that that's as much as we're going to report. I'm in favor of moving to a verbal scale, but that's something that I just don't see a lot of agencies in the U.S. ready to go there yet.
Right. So it's not quite to a verbal scale level, like we're describing here. We still lump most of the inconclusives all together, but we've just separated out this one part of the inconclusive, this very strong support, describing that, separating it out from the identifications, and it is, again, just like your agency. It isn't for everyone at our agency. There are some examiners who just won't reach that and use that option. They may be just not comfortable explaining that in court, or however they feel about it personally. But there are other examiners that feel comfortable with that, and then have put that out there in reports. We haven't had a chance to testify to this type of conclusion yet, but if it comes up, we'll talk about it here.
So for me, when it came to using qualified conclusions, and something that really impacted me was a case. And I had this case, and I've shared this case with a lot of my classes. So if any listeners who have taken the Advanced HV class, or even taken the stats class with Cedric and I, may have heard me talk about this case before, but it's my spoon case. Eric, I think you might remember the spoon case from those courses as well.
Absolutely, I remember it vividly.
So I'm just going to give a very quick rundown. It was this case where essentially a woman was, her claim was that she was raped by these three guys, and these guys were living in an apartment in the same apartment building down the hall, and they were having a party, and she had told them several times, keep the noise down, keep the noise down. And at some point, there was a knock on her door. She answers the door, and they force their way into her apartment. And according to her, they take her into the back bedroom and they rape her. And the guys don't deny actually being in the apartment. They don't deny having sex with her. Their story is that it was consensual, and that she had actually invited them in, and that she was a bit kinky, because what it came down to was there was this spoon that she was sodomized with, and the spoon had a fingerprint on it, and the fingerprint, in our view, didn't have enough information to identify one of the three guys. They had enough information to exclude the other two and the victim, but there was pattern and a good 7, possibly an 8th minutia in correspondence with the third guy. And then there were also a couple of subtle differences, but they were in distorted areas of the fingerprint. So it was this really on the edge fingerprint for us that we just couldn't identify. And I was the verifier, and I received it blind, so I didn't know anything about the case. The initial examiner was on the edge. He was inconclusive. He gave it to me as a blind case, not knowing any details, and I ended up inconclusive. But then we also gave it to a third examiner, blind in this, without any case information, and he reached an inconclusive. So all of us were coming to the same thing, and if we were in Alice's agency, it would have been cannot exclude. If we were in your agency, it would have been unable to exclude, but also unable to identify, as you just described it. And if we're using a verbal scale, it would be very strong evidence to support they're from the same source. But in the end, not enough for us to identify. You following me so far? You remember these elements?
I do.
Okay.
I remember you've given it to in those classes where you've given it as an example. What's typically the breakdown between examiners that will identify it versus ones that say inconclusive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I give it to them in the same way that we had it, where they don't know any case details, and it's about 50%, maybe 60% will identify it. So it's pretty much right on the edge. Right.
That's what I remember as well.
Yep. And so I mean, it's definitely one of those where reasonable experts can disagree that there is sufficient information and agreement to individualize. Okay. And so in the end, we went with inconclusive. We reported out an inconclusive. And there was discussion around the time of the court, of when it was going to court, how would this be presented? Would we present a chart showing features in agreement, but an inconclusive? Would we discuss inconclusive? How would this be discussed? And in the end, the prosecutor said, look, if you can't tell me it's him, definitive. If you can't see identification, I'm not even going to bother. I'm not even going to go there. And so he never introduced the evidence. This. He didn't introduce it at all. Didn't talk about it at all. And so, in the end, the jury never heard about this evidence. Now, one of the things about these three guys, as I said, they didn't dispute that they were there and that they were involved and in the room. However, the guy whose fingerprint we believe was on that spoon was the one guy that said, I didn't go in that room. I didn't engage in any of that stuff, and said, I never touched that spoon. That essentially he was the only one denying any real involvement with this. He said he was in the apartment, he said he was in the other room drinking and playing video games, and he didn't engage in any of the other activity. He just stayed out of the whole thing. But his was the only fingerprint that we found on the spoon. Now, he could have handed that spoon in the room. That doesn't mean he was in the room. He could have touched it in some other manner. But when he said, in his statement, I never touched that spoon, well, we have evidence, of course, that suggests very strongly that he did touch that spoon. You
Right.
have 4 people in a limited environment from the last time that spoon was washed in the dishwasher who might have been able to have handled that. Very limited population of people, and now you've got very strong evidence supporting that he's from the same source. And in the context of this case, had we had statistics, had we had likelihood ratios that we could have used and presented to the court, this would have been really important evidence, I think, for a jury to hear. Especially, and I didn't sit through the whole trial, but if he got up on the stand at any point and said, I never touched this, well, I mean, there would be evidence, of course, that would suggest that he may
Right.
have touched it.
Yeah.
And in that context, I think it mattered a lot. And so the notion that we always have to go to court with an ID or an exclusion, and that's all we need to present, this case really showed me, no, that doesn't have to be that way. That is a convention we have chosen as a profession, and in fact, the jury has a right to hear about evidence that suggests it's leaning one way or the other. We as a profession have made the decision for them. You will only hear, if it's an identification or an exclusion. Although in this case, the prosecutor made that decision, and
Right.
that's his choice. But I mean, I think you get my point. Is that we have decided juries will only hear IDs, or they'll only hear exclusions, and everything else is inconclusive. And I don't know. Well, I certainly don't think that's right, and I don't know why we think that is the only way it should be presented to juries.
And that's that's really why we went forward. I think it was right after sitting through your stat class and hearing this story, combined also with reading Alice's paper on how they presented at their agency, that really started leading us down this road of, well, how, if we were to present this stuff in court, how would we want to present it? How would we want to phrase it in our reports? And which is why we also moved away from the cannot exclude. I understand why Alice is says that at their agency, but we wanted to get away, I guess, from the word exclude when we're saying that there's strong evidence towards the ID side.
I actually like that. You could use that phrase. There's strong evidence to support they're from
Right.
the same source.
So what we ended up with was saying, first stating that it was inconclusive, that we're still in this inconclusive box, but there are features in agreement, just to provide more information than just saying that it's a straight inconclusive. I guess we're trying to say where we are, which box we're in, but then that we're leaning this other way because of this evidence that we see in the comparison.
Right. And so the downside here is that, as I've heard some examiners say, that if you open up that box, you'll start filling the jails with wrongfully convicted people, because now you're suggesting that there is an association. Even if it's not an identification, you're suggesting there's some kind of association. It's not an ID, but there's something there, and so now you've got this rate of misleading evidence that you're allowing for, and you're going to have many, many more people being convicted on very weak fingerprint evidence. And I don't know if I buy into that argument, because again, if that's the case, well then DNA analysts should stop going to court right now, because they're going to court, on partial profiles that could be shared by, 1 in 100 people.
Yeah,
right. Millions of other people, hundreds of millions of other people, and they go to court on that all the time. So I mean, if that's the argument, I don't buy it. And the second thing is, I think we really have to think about the context. I don't know any prosecutor that's going to go to court on a single partial fingerprint that has some associative power. I don't know any prosecutor that's going to go to court on a partial footwear impression that is just the same size.
Right.
The OJ case wasn't just that there were the Bruno Magli shoes of the same size. There was a ton of other stuff in that case.
Right. Like a full profile.
Look, DNA profiles and other stuff. And just, I mean, all the other stuff in that case. It's just the notion that someone is going to take really, really, really weak evidence and go to court on it in today's courtroom. I don't know. I don't buy it as much. I don't see a lot of weight behind that argument. But I mean, that's the other side that's being argued, is that by opening up that, you're now, increasing the proportion of wrongfully convicted individuals.
Yeah, and I think if when your agency does choose to make this leap into providing more detail at this end of the inconclusive spectrum, with that does come the responsibility of explaining it in court, and explaining it in a way that isn't one-sided and only from that prosecution view. It should be presented fairly with all of the limitations of that decision as well, so that you're guarding against that chance of the jury relying too heavily on this, I guess, limited match, or only very strong evidence instead of extremely strong evidence, so that they don't wrongfully convict somebody if that's the only thing that's available.
Yeah, and this is where I think in the previous episode we talked about Matthew Thompson and Tangen, who suggested that when testifying the fingerprints that we offer error rates, to put that in some kind of perspective. And so if we were testifying, to strong evidence associations like that, wouldn't be a bad idea to also suggest talking about the rate of misleading evidence, that when presenting this kind of evidence, because you're not saying it's that person, you're at a lower threshold, to get there. The chance that it could be someone else, increases, and that's something if you present that kind of risk assessment to the jury, again, I think any reasonable jury is going to take that in the context of the case and all the other information. But it might be helpful to express, that present your strong evidence to support, but then also talk about the rate of misleading evidence, and that might be one approach.
One of the things that we were worried about before we moved into having this as an option was whether or not our examiners would overuse that conclusion. So instead of so what we would end up is, instead of opening up the inconclusive box more, we would also creep into and start taking things that we would used to call IDs and then putting them into this kind of new area of the inconclusive box.
Intriguing. Yeah.
So we talked that through, and we wanted everyone to as they were considering using this conclusion, to really think through whether or not they would call it an ID if they didn't have this option, so that they weren't just playing it safe all the time and saying, okay, anything that's hard, I'm just going to go with this kind of almost there conclusion. Since we've implemented it, it's really only been used a handful of times, so we haven't really seen this overuse of that conclusion, where it's taking away things that could have been IDs.
No, that's very interesting. That's something that I hadn't considered, and that would be an interesting area for research.
All right, well, Glenn, I think we've kind of covered everything that we want to on our qualified conclusions. Anything you wanted to add on it?
Well, I think we're still left with a question towards the end here is, well, in what cases will this matter? In what cases would qualified conclusions be helpful, to a jury or a fact finder? And that, of course, involves having case information. And as we've heard in the past, having case information can lead to bias issues and these types of things. And so it's a nice setup for a discussion of when should case information be introduced, how should analysts manage case information, and is it appropriate for them to make decisions based off of case information? How do we manage and handle that?
And I think that will lead into a really good tease for next week's episode of the Double Loop Podcast, where we're hoping to get in Dr. David Charlton all the way from the UK as a guest on the show.
Definitely.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for another week of the Double Loop Podcast. As always, look for us Tuesday mornings on iTunes, on Stitcher, or on SoundCloud. Leave some comments if you have anything to add to the podcast on the SoundCloud page. And you can, again, download the SoundCloud app to your phone if you want to listen to us that way. Or if you already have iTunes or some other podcast software, you can look for us through that. So if you have anything else to contribute over email, send it to us at glenn@eliteforensicservices.com. And until next week, we will catch you then. Bye, everybody.
Have a good week. Bye. Hey, everybody. Got a Daubert or a Freiherren coming up, and your attorney is looking for an outside expert at the last minute to testify? Defense needs competent experts to review some fingerprint cases? Your agency needs some customized or specialized training for their training dollars to be used up at the end of the year? Then check out Elite Forensic Services at eliteforensicservices.com. You can find all of our services there, see all of our consultants and friends. You can even find links to our professional presentations and podcasts, too. Go to Elite Forensic Services today and check it out.